So welcome to Migrating to Jamf Cloud without falling back to earth. I'm Brian Martin. I'm an ordinary Jamf long-term Jamf admin, and with me today I have Jesse Dresselhaus, a Jamf professional services engineer. He's specifically the one who assisted us in our migration. And together we hope to demystify the tech side of migrating to Jamf Cloud. A little bit of background. In my case, I've been working on Apple stuff for Lafayette School Corporation, school district in Lafayette, Indiana, for a little over 18 years. We've been a Jamf customer since 2012, and I've made it to just about every I think I've made it to every JNUC since then, and I've actually had a chance to speak at the last three. This year, you could say my portion of this presentation is 4 years in the making. I've been wanting to get Jamf to take over hosting our server for 4 years now, and up until recently, I haven't been able to surmount the tech issues or the finance issues, but Jamf's made some changes, we've made some changes, and the pandemic especially made some changes, and that made this year an attractive time to do a smooth migration. And I'm here to share our story with our organization's experience with this transition.
Awesome. And like Brian said, my name is Jesse. I'm a pro services engineer here with Jamf. Primarily, I do migrations. Back before COVID, I was traveling around the country working with new customers, doing jump starts and different engagements. Looking forward to sharing some of the pros, the cons, the pitfalls, considerations of migrating to the cloud. So we'll kick it off with Brian talking about some external benefits.
Well, so the benefits we saw right away, even as far as 4 years ago, is I don't have to maintain or secure a separate instance of Tomcat out in the DMZ. Everybody who has had to deal with either an InfoSec team or somebody else on the team saying, hey, should we really be putting a server out in the DMZ or even externally? Well, yeah, in this case, let's just put the whole thing externally. We have very minimal inbound firewall rules. With migrating to Jamf Cloud, we have now available a cloud distribution point, which solves my problem of getting software to computers off the campus a lot more elegantly than what we were doing before. And it really gets back to COVID-19 really forced me to think about this. It made me ask the question, are our devices equal citizens both internally and externally? And the answer is now almost yes. I do still have some work to do on that front, but it's not really related to hosting. I want everybody to be able to function properly at home or at work with the proper security in place in both places. And always, because you're hosted externally, your JSS is going to be functional, even if, say, you're having a bad network day. Well, your JSS is still functional, and your end users at home are still going to be able to get their work done. That's external benefits. Internally, so what I'm seeing right away that I've benefited from already is I don't have any more. We have a weekly maintenance window Wednesday evening where we get to do changes that we need to be made in either the server or the back end or whatnot. I don't have to spend Wednesday nights at 10 o'clock after my children are in bed donking around trying to upgrade the Windows OS or remembering to stop Tomcat, do this, do that, start Tomcat back in this order because we had a cluster before. That's Jamf's problem now. We're paying them. And on Jamf's part to that, they give right off the bat a 3 nines availability commitment to keeping it up. I'm able to take some of those VMs that we used in a cluster and use them for other things within the district, and also it allowed me to reallocate some other hardware we had to provide better caching. I don't have to think about being a hoster anymore. I don't have to worry about coming in at 8 o'clock in the morning saying, okay, is the server up? Did we have a power outage that night? Again, that's time I can spend on, okay, I got an email last night saying, hey, you need to do this to help somebody out. I can focus on giving a better experience to my end users. And I'm going to make a very bold statement and say that since our migration, I have not noticed any observable difference in terms of latency or speed with our environment. Mm-hmm. Now, your mileage is going to vary on that. We've got 10 gig pipe going out with fiber connections to our buildings, and we've got a very strong internal distribution point and caching server presence. But when I tuned those caching servers, I'm not in a simple student iPad enrollment doesn't take any more time than it did before when it was on campus. I figured there would be some latency involved.
So maybe you're hearing these benefits from Brian, and right away you're like, yep, get us to the cloud. We got to get going. And I'm here to tell you about some of the options that we have available for that. So you'll see 3 options on the screen here: custom DNS migration, standard migration, and fresh start migration. We'll talk mostly about custom DNS migrations today for 2 reasons. First, they're by far the most popular workflow, and it just so happens to be the workflow that Brian and I went together on. Probably the reason that they're the most popular workflow is because it is the only workflow that does not require you to re-enroll all of your iOS, tvOS, and macOS devices. And so that's a huge plus for this workflow. It does, however, also have the most stringent requirements for migration. You'll see that on the next screen. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But essentially, what it looks like is you give us a database backup. We take that backup, we process that into the cloud. We do an AWS URL validation so that we can actually put your old Jamf URL in the SSL certificate for the cloud server. And then we do a DNS redirect. And because we validated your URL for the SSL certificate, when the devices get redirected via a CNAME in DNS, they're going to inherently trust that connection. They'll still think they're checking into jss.company.com. That's redirecting them now to company.jamfcloud.com. They're trusting that connection, and basically nothing else needs to happen. So that's the custom DNS workflow. We do have some other workflows available, however. The standard migration is probably the least common workflow. It's a database backup, and then you re-enroll everything. So this is used in instances where the old URL is not desired or can't be used. One of the requirements for custom DNS is it does need to be a fully qualified domain name because you need to be able to do the external DNS record change. And so if your Jamf Pro URL, as it shows in your Jamf Pro summary, is company.local or 10.1.52.98 or something like that, you cannot do a custom DNS redirect. So that's kind of one of the scenarios that a standard migration happens. In the standard migration, like I said, you do need to re-enroll, and that's a combination of wiping devices and using automated device enrollment, unenrolling with the Jamf Pro console, and then doing a manual user-initiated enrollment, or pushing out a quick add package from your old server in a policy to then enroll in the new server, and we've got some tools to help you out with that. Do keep in mind that if you do the quick add package, all devices will need to have the MDM profile manually approved for a user-approved MDM. The last option that you see on the screen here is the fresh start migration. This is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's a fresh start. No database backup. All devices are re-enrolled. This is actually probably the second most common option because there are 0 requirements for it. It's used in some of the same situations that a standard migration is used, but also it's really useful if you don't like your database. If your database is not usable, maybe it's on a really old version of Jamf and you can't get it upgraded because being on the latest version is a requirement for us to take your database. Or you're just looking as an admin at your server and saying, hey, I don't know what this is. I don't know what's going on. Everything's broken. I want to start over. So that's what the fresh start is. Another big advantage is with the fresh start, you can pretty much start right away. We'll spin a server up for you, send you some starting steps, some starting ideas, and let you kind of just start off right away. So this is useful if you're comfortable with Jamf. You're not willing to wait. Typically, right now at least, we've got about a 2 to 3 week turnaround time for migrations. So if you're like, nope, we got to get started tomorrow, fresh start might be good for you. And then the actual day of the migration, the time that we scheduled together with an engineer, would be used to validate workflows and troubleshoot any issues. So with the fresh start, we do have a tool on our GitHub page called the Jamf Migrator tool that leverages the API to transfer over things like policies and configuration profiles. So and re-enrollment does still need to occur.
So the fresh start,
you'll see here oh, go ahead, Brian. Sorry.
So the fresh start, I want to take a second and talk about that. So last year, I did it was the previous year. I did a presentation on at the time what I thought was the sorry state of our Mac environment. If you're running into an environment where you're not able to do the things you want to do, like 2 or 3 years ago, I wasn't able to really leverage the Mac App Store really well. I wasn't able to do DEP managed workflow because we were sharing that with another. I mean, we had a long laundry list of things, including all of our Macs at the time were running a really old operating system. And because nobody had ever complained, I didn't really decide to do anything about it. But a couple, 3 years ago when I left JNUC, it forced me to take a hard look at our server, and I decided at the time that fresh start, this would be an ideal time if you've seen that presentation to consider that fresh start, because if your server's growing, yeah, Jesse can probably help you out. But if your server's going nowhere like ours was 3 years ago, that fresh start is a wonderful gift almost.
Yeah. And so what Brian did was he did a fresh start himself, had an on-prem server and started over on-prem. But if you're looking at your server and you don't like what's going on, it's buggy, you don't have a good URL anymore, you change domains, and you need to start fresh anyways, maybe it's a good opportunity to start fresh in the cloud. So as far as requirements for the 3 migration options, I guess I'll take this opportunity to say that this presentation, we've got 30 minutes. I could probably talk an hour about migration. So at the end of the day, this is a little bit of a simplified look at things. Please get in touch with Jamf and we'll have some more information about that at the end of the presentation. Get in touch with us for some more details or to set up a call with someone. But in a nutshell, the requirements for the different migration options are as you see on here. The custom DNS migration does have the most stringent of the requirements. You do need to have a fully qualified domain name because for 2 reasons. You need to do the DNS redirect, and so you have to own that DNS record. But also the AWS validation, that's done via email. And so the way that we determine those emails are automated. They go out to 5 different email addresses: admin, administrator, hostmaster, postmaster, and webmaster. All at your domain. And the way that your domain is determined is take your Jamf Pro URL and you chop off the first chunk. And so if your URL is jss.company.com, it's going to go to admin@company.com, webmaster@company.com. You get the drift. And so if your URL is company.internal.ad.jss.company.com or something ridiculous like that, trust me, I've seen it. You might not have access to make those emails. And if that's the case, you can't do a custom DNS, typically. So, but yeah, fully qualified domain name, ability to manage DNS changes internally and externally, access to those standard 5 email addresses that we talked about, and having your server on the latest version of Jamf. For the standard migration, all we care about is the server being on the latest version. And for the fresh start, we have no requirements because you're starting fresh.
I wanted to clarify on the access to standard emails. We didn't need access to all 5 back when we did it. We only had to do
yes.
Whichever. We just needed any one of those 5. I had to get a little bit of help from our email team to actually get those messages forwarded to me for about an hour at the time.
Yep. Definitely. So moving to the cloud is a pretty straightforward process, but there are some considerations to keep in mind, more than you're going to see right here, but these are kind of the big ones. The first one is network architecture, specifically around LDAP. And so the thing to keep in mind is that when you have an on-prem server, you've got an on-prem server and you've got an internal LDAP server. Those are both behind your firewall. They're both internally. That communication is pretty easy. But if you're moving your cloud server or your Jamf server externally, that's now outside your firewall, and your firewall will likely be blocking any sort of LDAP connection. And so to make that LDAP connection externally accessible, there are some different options that you've got. First off, you could just make actually, let me back up. First off, ask yourself this. Do you even need an LDAP connection in your Jamf Pro server? Is LDAP needed in your server environment? And so there are a couple questions around that. Are you authenticating on enrollment for your users? Are you doing scoping based off of LDAP groups or attributes? If the answer to those are no, and the only thing that you're using LDAP for is maybe authenticating as an admin into the Jamf Pro console, you might not need to use that LDAP anymore. Maybe you're fine just using local users or using SSO for authentication. The important thing to remember is SSO is authentication, LDAP is user queries and user lookups for information. And so if you do decide that, yes, we do use LDAP, we do user queries, we do assignments of things, we authenticate on enrollment, got some options. First off, the easiest, but probably the least common and arguably the least secure is making your server externally accessible. If you do this, it's highly, highly recommended that you either do it in conjunction with LDAP-S, LDAP over SSL, or using a read-only DC, or potentially both. I know Brian did this with his organization. He was mulling over some LDAP ideas and some things, and ended up talking with one of his network and LDAP guys, and they were like, "Yeah, we got a read-only DC that we can use." And so that's what they ended up using, and it worked great. For some organizations, though, that's not possible. That's not set up, or security kind of scoffs at that and says we can't do that, and that's totally fine. Some other options are setting up an LDAP proxy. We've got a tool called the Jamf Infrastructure Manager, also known as the JIM, that would sit in the DMZ, as you see on this architecture here, and it would proxy that communication between your LDAP server and your Jamf Cloud server. Otherwise, we integrate with a third-party IDP, Google's cloud identity, but there are some unofficial guides out there for Okta and Azure LDAP integration as well.
So the next slide is actually, I don't know if you've ever been to a presentation and somebody said, "Oh, and everything's going to be all perfect." Well, I can safely say that most things with our migration were perfect, but there's one small thing that kind of irks me, and that there's not much Jamf can do about it. But there was a gentleman on Jamf Nation that had a unique look at it. So the short of it is, when all your devices check in with their IP address, by default on Macs, MDM will pull the IP address, but you'll also get the last reported IP address. But on iPads, you just get what MDM reports. So unfortunately now, as a result of this migration, when I see the list of IP addresses for my devices, they all show our external IP address for the school district. And for obvious reasons, I'm not going to share that screenshot here with you, but when I'm looking at 200 devices all reporting the same external IP address, I'm like, well, how am I going to use this to narrow down anything? The gentleman on this URL that I posted on the slide had a unique idea of maybe getting self-service, the app on iPads, to collect a last reported IP address. I think that'd be a great starting point. I don't know if the Jamf engineers are going to be able to do it, but if you're really worried about having accurate IP addresses in your database, you probably ought to vote that up. But so far, other than that, I've not really had any negatives.
So another thing to keep in mind is distribution points. I think Brian's going to talk about this.
Okay, sorry, I was just being respectful there. So distribution.
No, that's okay.
I talked about earlier that one of the biggest benefits is you're going to have access to your Jamf Cloud distribution service. That is something that would have come in handy about 2 or 3 years ago when I'm trying to figure out how to get packages off the campus. What you can do ahead of time is you can plan this out. You can look at your network segments, and if you don't have a network segment that covers your external one, it's very easy to add it. You basically just do 1.0.0.0 all the way through 255.255.255. You could do something like that, because the way that Jesse explained to me that Jamf Pro works is I can define an IP address twice, a larger scope of IPs versus a smaller scope of IPs. The more closely defined smaller scope of IPs is what it's going to use to actually determine which distribution points you go to. So it's pretty easy to build yourself a external devices network segment and then have that point to your off-campus distribution point versus the narrowly defined one for your on-campus distribution point. And because on Macs, where you use distribution points, it relies on the last reported IP address, you're not going to run into that bug that I told you about on iPads. One piece of advice, Jesse's going to go into the steps of how to do the migration and whatnot, but I would highly advise that you maybe audit all your policies ahead of time and figure out, okay, on campus, I'm going to use this DP. Off campus, I'm going to use this DP. Do I want this policy to run on campus? Do I want it to run off campus? Having a good idea of what all your policies are and where you want them to eventually go is probably going to save you a lot of time on the pre-migration call or the post-migration work. Unfortunately, your JCDS is not going to be available until after the migration, because it uses your Jamf Pro server uses the activation code to determine whether you have access to that JCDS. So I'm going to hand this back over to Oh, this is one more for me. I'm going to cover the before the pre-call. So this is the time where you're going to want to get all your pricing negotiation, your licensing. I actually timed our migration to our renewal. You want to get all business matters put to bed before you're even on the phone with Jesse trying to figure this out, because he's here to help you with the tech stuff. Your Jamf reps are going to be your best bet for the business end. I would also know the ins and outs of your server like the back of your hand. I would know more than just a full JSS summary. I'm going to want to know the URLs. I want to know how to get DNS changed in my district if I needed to have those redirects that Jesse's going to talk about. I want to know LDAP. I want to know how it's going to work off campus versus on campus. You need to know your server in and out. That's going to make the call with Jesse go a lot shorter.
Definitely. So once you got that all taken care of, pricing, licensing, all that, and you've purchased the migration, that's all closed, you're going to get an email from one of our service operations managers asking you to schedule a migration pre-call. And the pre-call is really just a time, roughly 30 minutes, to talk with either myself or another engineer on my team to talk about what the migration is going to look like. We're going to talk about the 3 different options. Or maybe you'll have watched this JNUC presentation and you're going to know right away what option you do want. We'll talk about that option. We'll talk about what works best for you, requirements, all of that, and make sure that you fit into the right bucket for the workflow. We're going to discuss LDAP plans a little bit more in depth potentially. One big thing that we highly, highly, highly recommend, borderline require, is if you do need to do some LDAP work between the pre-call and the migration, we'll give you access to your cloud server ahead of time, just as kind of a test dev environment for you to test out a cloud LDAP integration. So that way, if it's network infrastructure or if it's a cloud IDP, you can test that out, work out any kinks that there might be. So then that way, on the day of the migration, you've taken screenshots, you've taken documentation, you can just recreate what you did. And so the pre-call really is about figuring out an option, discussing all the different considerations of developing a script and game plan for leading up to the migration day, but also the migration day itself. Between the pre-call and the migration is where really the bulk of the work happens. Coordinating resources on your end. This could be really easy depending on your organization. Maybe you're an organization where you've got 50 Macs, you're Mac only, and you're a team of 2. for IT. And so you're the person who does the database backup, the DNS changes, the email validation, everything. In that case, coordinating resources is easy. On the other hand, you might be a state university that has tens of thousands of Macs and iPhones and iPads. Coordinating resources probably is going to be a lot more difficult because it's going to be a DNS team, an LDAP team, a Jamf Pro team. And so coordinating all those resources together to get them on the same page and either get them available on the day of the migration or at least to a point where the appropriate things can happen. Like we talked about, the LDAP proof of concept will happen between the pre-call and the migration. Cleaning up your server, that's just like kind of auditing, like Brian was talking about, auditing policies that you have that you might want to take this as an opportunity to get rid of. Cleaning up any packages, because we all know that probably way too many of you still have macOS Yosemite installers on your distribution point that no one absolutely ever would need ever again. So take this opportunity to clean that up a little bit before you copy that over. But I also, as a part of the pre-call, I'll take a look at your Jamf Pro summary and your database and see if there's anything as far as tables that maybe you need to truncate, work with support on that. And then we'll schedule a migration date. So we'll send you off a link to schedule a date when you're ready. Typically, we're about 2 to 3 weeks out after the pre-call. But if you hop on a pre-call with me and you're like, yeah, this is a terrible time, we just want to talk about it now, can we schedule 3 months from now? We can usually make that happen too. So day of the migration, this whole presentation is kind of an analogy and a metaphor for what the migration timeline actually looks like, because we're about 85 to 90% done with our presentation right now, and we're just now talking about the actual migration day, and that's what your migration should hopefully feel like. All the work is on the front end, and then once you actually get to the day of the migration, this part's usually easy. So we schedule a 4-hour block for the migration just because sometimes that's what's needed. Everyone knows in IT, you always give yourself some buffer, but I'll say on average, I'm usually done in about 2 to 2.5 hours, and that was what Brian's took as well.
I was going to say,
on the day
I'm happy to report our migration took exactly 2 hours.
Yep. So on the day of the migration, or the night before, you'll do a database upload. We will take that database, we'll validate it, we'll run some checks on that, make sure it looks good. You'll do that AWS SSL validation with the emails like we talked about. Then we'll do the DNS changes. We'll do it externally, wait for that to propagate, do that internally after. Once that's all good, your devices are going to start checking into your cloud server. We'll log in. We'll do a DEP renewal, talk about replicating your packages, get LDAP working, do some final tests, and you'll be well on your way. So that part's easy most of the time. So as far as next steps, if you're hearing this presentation and you're like, yep, sign me up, get me in the cloud, I need to be in the cloud yesterday, we can make that happen. I mean, not yesterday, but as soon as we can. Contact your customer success manager with any questions you might have. success@jamf.com. That's going to be your best resource. They'll be able to get you in touch with people for licensing or pricing or technical questions. They can reach out to me and forward on any questions that you might have. And we'd be more than happy to work with you to get you off of your on-prem server and into the cloud. So with that, this is Brian. I'm Jesse. Thanks so much for listening. It was a fun time. JNUC looks different this year, but we're happy to have been with all of you for this little chunk of time. Give us some feedback. Click on the widget below and complete a survey and let us know what we can do to help you going forward and help you succeed with Apple. So thanks again for listening.
Thank you.